Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? It seems the more mainstreaming of mindfulness occurs, the more its claims are being questioned. Ron Purser, professor of management and author of the groundbreaking new book, McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality, has been a longtime critic of the widespread mainstreaming and overselling of mindfulness practices. He views mainstream mindfulness as an amplifier of Western consumerist individualism and a banal form of capitalist spirituality, one he claims utterly avoids cultivation of social and political transformation. Ron challenges the widely accepted narrative that stress is self-imposed and mindfulness is the cure-all, and offers ways for mindfulness delivery in healthcare and business settings to cast off its neoliberal shackles and be redirected toward collective awakening. Ron and I have known each other for quite some time. He is erudite and engaging. I truly hope you enjoy this stimulating and intimate dialogue. Ron Purser, it is a complete joy and a great honor to have you on the Groundless Ground podcast.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a long time.
You have a new book out, McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. And of course, we're going to talk a lot about your new book. But you know, I actually would like to let the listeners get to know you because you have such an interesting combination of interests and professional pursuits. I really want people to know why you, of all people, would be writing this book on McMindfulness. You are a professor of management at SFSU. You've also been in the Dharma as a practitioner and a teacher in the Zen Dharma tradition and also Chartang Talkyu Rinpoche's tradition.
Yeah, I've been based in academia for 30 years now. I'm looking forward to retirement. Yeah, my discipline is management and organizational behavior. But even within my own discipline, I have not really been in the mainstream in terms of my professional interests. I'm really kind of a misfit, even in the College of Business. I really shouldn't be located there. You know, I started formally being drawn into Buddhist teachings around 1981, 1982, although I was dabbling and, exploring before that. I always felt that the Buddhist teachings were operating in the background and sort of guiding me into what I would be working on. Like I was interested in ecological and environmental responsibility in the field of organizations back in the 1990s. And then I got interested in time and how our digital society was starting to influence every domain of our life. So this was a way of kind of indirectly being guided by the Buddhist teachings, but I was never explicit about it in my writings until very recently. And
did you make a conscious decision at some point to just come out of the closet as a Buddhist?
The field of management is actually pretty open about taking ideas from other areas and developing them. And there was a journal that started, I think, around 2005. It was called the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion. So in my own professional field, they were entertaining ideas like this. And I said, wow, this looks like a window of opportunity for me to maybe perhaps start writing about Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist psychology, what it might have to offer to the field of management. I actually did some writing with the late Albert Lowe, who was a remarkable Zen teacher, a remarkable man, and his books really influenced me. So we co-authored an article and did some other things together. So that was the beginning of it. And then when I started to see mindfulness start to pop up in mainstream culture, especially when I started to watch YouTube videos of what was going on in Google in the early days when they were just starting to think about how to bring in mindfulness into Google, that's when it really piqued my interest. That's when I really started to pay more attention. And it's interesting that I really didn't know much about mindfulness.
Can we just stop for a moment?
Okay. I didn't.
I actually think this is one of the core pieces that I wanted you to sort of communicate to the listeners, because it is a theme that runs throughout your book. The way mindfulness has grown up in the West is
Hmm.
not necessarily something that someone who is very involved in Korean Zen tradition would necessarily recognize.
Right, because the Buddhist modernist Vipassana insight is what is the dominant mainstream understanding of mindfulness in the West.
I think I'd like to start with a quote from your book. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Most of the promoters of mindfulness are nice. And having personally met many of them, including the leaders of the movement, I have no doubt that their hearts are in the right place. But that isn't the issue here. The problem is the product they're selling and how it's been packaged. Mindfulness, like positive psychology and the broader happiness industry, has depoliticized and privatized stress.
Yeah, I think that's probably the core thesis of the book, trying to understand how did we latch on to the stress discourse, because that was new to me. I made some discoveries in my own research as I was reading about that.
Why don't we go to what you call the stress discourse? Give us a bit of a sense of what you mean when you use that term.
I think the stress discourse is that it's been billed as an epidemic and it's inevitable part of our modern capitalist culture. By buying into the idea that stress is just a given and it's just a part of modern life, then it's up to us to kind of mindful up to deal with stress. But there's a lot more going on behind that. There's ideological components to the stress discourse which aren't really thought about or considered in the mindfulness movement. The discourse of stress is really kind of embedded in a biomedical paradigm from psychiatry, psychology, biology, medicine. It frames stress as an individual level problem. And by doing that, it sort of cuts off inquiry into historical or social and political context of stress. And so I think the leaders, although as you said, they're well intentioned, but they rarely question this discourse of stress. In a way, they have a deep investment in it because selling mindfulness is sort of stress reduction. One of the issues throughout the book is the individualizing of social problems. There's a great woman whose book that I read that really turned me on to some of these issues. Dana Becker, she coins the term stressism. Basically, stressism is a way of thinking about stress as just purely a lifestyle problem and that it's not linked to social forces. From that perspective, that is what really triggered me to look deeper into this. And as I did, I even found kind of another version of stress in the late 19th century. It was called neurasthenia, also known as American nervousness. It was very fashionable, actually. So neurasthenia was considered a lack of nerve energy. It was actually a badge of honor among the middle and upper classes because they saw it as a challenge of adapting to the modern pressures of industrialization at the time. That diagnosis faded by the early 20th century. By the 1950s, we begin to see the emergence of stress. But the thing that you hear a lot in the mindfulness movement, our caveman ancestors had to face predators like the saber-toothed tiger. Our biology evolved to have the fight-flight instinct that became hardwired into our human biology. But since our brains haven't really evolved that much since the caveman Stone Age era, we still fall back on the fight-flight instinct. And so we overreact to things. They're not saber-toothed tigers anymore, but there's someone who is criticizing us or whatever it may be. So unlike the hunter-gatherers that led a leisurely lifestyle, had time to go back in the cave to overcome their adrenaline rush, keep going on with our lives, and we accumulate stress. And we begin to hear the term that we're stressed out. That term really didn't emerge until like the 1980s. So the mindfulness solution is that we need to self-regulate, which is now jazzed up with a lot of neuroscience. The premise is if we had only evolved further biologically, which we haven't, that we would be fine. But because that's not the case, that we have to manage stress. And so stress is not seen as part of the social and political context. And that if we had evolved further biologically, capitalist societies would have no stress or conflicts. We'd be fine. But instead, we have to eradicate these antiquated problems. And so it's up to us to self-correct. And so it's a form of like biological reductionism in a way. And capitalist economy is simply taken as a given that we have to adapt to. So it naturalizes stress.
You know, I was trained in MBSR many years ago. What you're describing was never part of my training in terms of the science of stress. In fact, that really hardly talked about, honestly, back then. It's true, it may be much more part of the discourse because psychology has taken up Robert Sapolsky's work and many other people's work talking about the way the mind has compensated for a lifestyle that is not particularly healthy for most people. And that's for all kinds of reasons, individual behavior. It's also because of the culture we live in and because of environmental conditions that are not actually good for us either. There's a whole lot of things that come together. So that particular narrative about stress, I don't think is particular to mindfulness. In Buddhist psychology, and when I say Buddhist psychology, I don't mean modern Buddhist psychology. I mean from the Buddhist teachings in all three schools, the word stress does not exist, but the word klesha does exist. Afflictive emotions in Buddhism are the source of almost all human suffering. I would say that pretty much all the schools of Buddhism have a particular recipe for being able to identify, recognize, and work with the afflictive emotions so that as a human being, you are not behaving in a way that causes harm, and you might even be alleviating harm and suffering that are arising in other people. There are many concepts from that kind of mind training and Buddhist philosophy and its practical application in many of the meditation practices that come out of Buddhism that were adopted by the mindfulness training, particularly MBSR. But what I don't think happened was I don't think the translation of the teachings about the kleshas and the afflictive emotions were communicated in MBSR. Instead, the thing you've mentioned is the stress narrative that Western physiology and Western psychology had picked up was the thing that came in. But there was a reason for that because there were all kinds of illnesses that doctors couldn't do anything about, and they were sending people into the basement to do this thing that John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli had created for people to see whether or not any of that would help, which is why I think the stress narrative got so intertwined with what they were doing.
Right. I think you're absolutely right about the kleshas. The way I've kind of envisioned this is a parallel to psychology, because we have psychology which focuses on the individual level, but there's also social psychology. And I don't think we've moved to social Buddhism, like a parallel from individual liberation, classic Buddhist teachings for that, to kind of social Buddhism.
Does Buddhism have a social psychology? I don't think so.
There really isn't much to go on from the classical Buddhist teachings when it comes to social and political issues and looking at suffering from a wider angle lens. In terms of the stress discourse, I think there's something else. And I completely acknowledge what you say about how MBSR was designed and developed to treat chronic illnesses, stress-related diseases. Once the genie got out of the bottle and mindfulness moved from the hospital clinics to other domains, I think that's where we really see the entanglement with an individualistic neoliberal ethos. So we also have to think about the medicalization of stress and the psychological way of thinking about stress, as you mentioned. Hans Selye, who was dubbed the father of stress in the 1950s.
Yes.
As I was looking at the history, I found some interesting parallels between the rise of the stress concept and the rise of mindfulness, because Hans Selye was a tireless self-promoter, and much of his research was based on rats, and he overgeneralized his findings from the laboratory, the rats, to human beings. And he got a lot of criticism from other researchers, but he became very evangelical towards the late 1950s, early 60s. And he started making really utopian prescriptions about what society should look like. But a number of scholars have said that stress was really a manufactured concept that became a social fact, because it was the popularity of the concept that made it true, even though there was a lot of contested research about Selye's research.
When I do an intake and somebody comes in, they use terms like stressed out, I'm stressed, which frankly, I have no idea what those terms mean when people say them because it's a catch-all. When I ask them to describe what they're actually experiencing, they are experiencing autonomic nervous system dysregulation.
Nobody's doubting that. What's the source of that? Is it purely their fault that they're experiencing stress? That it's no. I mean, that's why my book is it's challenging that narrative.
Because your book has a very particular point of view, especially when it comes to what you just said, which is what happened after MBSR and other stress reduction methods went into corporate culture. The thesis really works there. It breaks down a little bit in the healthcare setting because even though I agree with you, many of these terms don't really mean much of anything. We've evolved tremendously in terms of epigenetics and other things to be able to give people a better sense of the complexity of why something might be showing up for them. But I will give you, just like corporate America, it is rare. It happens in my office, but it is rare when a clinician will literally tell someone, you need to look at the chemicals in your house, you need to look at the neighborhood you live in, you need to look at the kinds of beliefs that you have, how you're comporting yourself in your community, are you contributing? This is not the purvey of psychology, and it should be.
Right. There's actually a subfield called critical psychology that is trying to move people in that direction.
Well, James Hillman did that. We've had 100 years of psychology, and look, you guys are still not dealing with the problems in people's actual lives that are collective problems. You mentioned the neoliberal mindset, which in your book, you attribute a lot of your critique around the way mindfulness is dispensed to it getting behind this neoliberal mindset. I really want you to describe what you mean when you say neoliberal mindset.
Well, let me start by talking about an experiment I did once. Is I Googled the word mindfulness, like mindfulness in schools, mindfulness in prisons, corporate mindfulness, and I looked at the images that came up. Always the image of a solitary individual sitting with no other people around that person with their eyes closed. Wait a minute. This is like a cultural representation. Really had no idea what neoliberalism was. So anyway, the more I dug into it, the more fascinated I became. I started reading Michel Foucault, who's a French philosopher. I've not read that much of Foucault, only bits and pieces. But there was one concept that he talked about, and it's a jargon-laden word, but it's called governmentality. Basically, what he was saying is that neoliberal institutions exercise micro levels of power, and that they're actually reformulating our subjectivity, our sense of identity. And he basically distinguished between techniques of domination and techniques of the self. Techniques of domination is where power operates outside of yourself. It's imposed upon the person. So we see that like in feudal societies, they would do public hangings, send a message to the populace. But techniques of the self is much more modern. And he refers to that as disciplinary power. And disciplinary power works at a micro level. So neoliberalism is all about creating a culture of enterprise. Individual well-being is sort of linked up with being able to be an entrepreneurial person within a capitalist economy. The techniques of the self relies a lot on institutions and institutional expertise to relay and transmit those forms of disciplinary power. The British sociologist Nicholas Rose is one of my heroes. He wrote a lot about what he called the side disciplines. And the side disciplines are linked to how institutional expertise became a way of influencing individual subjectivity. It's a way of harnessing these micro fields of power and having that seem as if it's consonant with individual freedom. But I think one of the key points is that neoliberalism and the mindfulness movement, they both conceive of social well-being in individualistic and psychologized ways. So for example, happiness is now a skill. We train our brains like a muscle. It's all individual effort. And so these skills can be developed without reliance on external factors. And that's kind of embedded then within a therapeutic discourse. So it reframes our problems as outcomes of individual choice, and so that our personal troubles are never linked or attributed to political or socioeconomic conditions. And from that perspective, that is really resonant with a neoliberal ethos, because neoliberalism wants to individualize all social problems too. And so it's through atomized individuals working on themselves alone without social support is part of the cultural milieu of neoliberalism.
So it is the cultural milieu of Western psychology.
Right.
Work on yourself in the room with a therapist. I keep hearing you say that neoliberal mindset makes it so that working on yourself is the only attractive thing.
Right. It's almost like a makeover, like refashioning. The self becomes a form of human capital that it has to constantly retool itself so that it's a competitive actor.
The thing that's missing then is the turning of the view outward so that a person might take what they've gained in terms of self-understanding or self-healing or whatever and offer that to the culture as a way for the society to be able to participate in that awakening, or we can use the word transformation, or we can use the word healing, whatever you want to use.
Yeah, absolutely right. People like William Davies in his book, The Happiness Industry, he basically says that a lot of depression is critique turned inwards. Like, as you say, we don't have the explanatory or counter narratives that would help us turn it outwards.
The other thesis that you had in your book, which I actually kind of agree with, you say that a fundamental tenet of neoliberal mindfulness as it's delivered is that the source of people's problems is actually in their heads.
Yeah, absolutely. It may be a bit repetitive in the book about that point, but well, that's another fallout of the depoliticized way of thinking about stress, too. Can I mention another scholar, Henry Giraud? He talks about neoliberalism is a disimagination machine. And what he means by that is that it stifles our critical and radical thinking because we're admonished constantly to turn inwards and manage ourselves, to work on ourselves and become more self-disciplined. It's a depoliticized framing because, as you said, psychology and neoliberalism are close bedfellows. Neoliberal political philosophy is afraid of collective action. It's afraid of solidarity. That would be counter to the whole premise of neoliberalism. You know, the destruction of unions, the austerity measures, pulling away of social welfare programs. That is all about deconstructing collective power of people working in solidarity with each other.
All the things you just mentioned, it appears as though it's in fact the conservatives who've been spearheading all of that.
Well, there's a lot of argument that it started with Bill Clinton. He was seen as a neoliberal centrist. And so you don't have to be Democrat or Republican. You can still be neoliberal and be a Democrat.
If I were to just summarize, neoliberalism does two things. It wants you to pay attention to yourself so you don't pay attention to the collective and the conditions around you. But it sounds like it doesn't even really want people to pay attention to anything other than their own needs.
Yeah.
It's very self-centered, yes?
Yeah.
Just to go back to Buddhism versus Western mindfulness, Buddhism is interesting. Buddhism wants you to understand the nature of suffering as it arises in the mind through the afflictive emotions. It wants you to have a set of skills in order to transform that. And ultimately, it wants you to function differently in your world so that you are lessening suffering. So do you feel as though when your critique of the mindfulness movement, that last piece is missing?
Oh, yeah.
So how come you think that happened? In all your research on the mindfulness movement, at what point do you think that tending for the people around you was not important? Because we could both say it's packaged as a therapy.
I think it's because it kind of piggybacked as a form of self-help. It's all related to the medicalization of stress, pathologizing of stress, the idea that it's an individual practice, the commodification of mindfulness. All these kind of forces are intertwined and entangled. The whole notion of inner and outer is a construct, at least in the Mahayana, Vajrayana teachings, that wouldn't even hold up.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a problem in the root metaphors that are informing modern mindfulness practices. And they see the mind as some container, an inner theater. There's almost like a Western Enlightenment way of thinking of some sort of objective inner observer that's contained in a particular spatial and temporal location. That to me is problematic as well, but that's a whole nother can of worms.
Your book brought up so many contradictions, which is why I think it's a fantastic book. So, at one point in your book, you do say that neoliberal mindfulness is a kind of self pacification. And one of the examples you give is you say, never mind what might cause you anxiety. Just be mindful of what's in front of your face and do your best to feel fuzzily warm. So, I thought this was an absolutely beautiful depiction of what modern mindfulness gets wrong in its translation of the Buddhist teachings. There is teaching on the essence of mind, which is the field of awareness. And Buddhism teaches that if you don't look into the mind as the mind actually is, you go through life not questioning the habitual ideation of self and other separateness.
Yeah.
We just grasp at the solidity of our views and our solitary existence. What you've done here is you've said the technique of resting in awareness in the mindfulness movement has turned into, well, just be aware of what's there and feel good.
Yeah.
This is got nothing to do with the recognition, analyzation, and capacity to understand the nature of the delusion of self and other separateness, anatta, that is the core of the Buddhist teachings.
I tried to not go too far into Buddhist analysis or Buddhist teachings. I'm hoping that the book will stand on its own, even without Buddhism in the dialogue. But I agree with you completely.
Your critique is what they've done and the way they've interpreted. They've only done it because it's a reflection of our capitalist culture and the way everything is marketed.
And this is what really irritated me, is the exaggerated claims that people make in the mindfulness movement and how this highly individualistic practice is going to miraculously transform and change our society. Everyone has a theory of change, and their theory of change is an individual theory of change. The ideological message also is, well, if you can't alter your circumstances, then you can change your reactions to circumstances. And that's good. I'm not just saying that that's undesirable, but to leave the conversation at that point is politically naive. As long as I'm mindful, I'm okay.
If MBSR went the next step, whatever it is you've done on the inside to shift your relationship with difficult external circumstances, apply that outside, would that take it away from being neoliberal mindfulness?
I don't think it's sufficient. Some people in the mindfulness movement have quite a big megaphone when they're speaking. John Kabat-Zinn and others.
He deserves to have a big microphone, doesn't he?
He has a big megaphone, but I'm saying it's such a lost opportunity to just spew out this individualistic rhetoric and make these grandiose claims that we're heading towards a global renaissance and individual mindfulness is going to even change fake news, and it's going to do everything. It's like a global panacea. And those exaggerated claims, I don't think they're helpful. We're at a juncture where we need mindfulness 2.0 is...
You're a very well-published, intelligent academic, and you are a Dharma teacher. So if you could come up with Mindfulness 2.0, what would it look like?
Well, that's the last chapter in the book where sketching some rough ideas about what that might look like. And I think that's my next project, articulating that. People like Mushim Akita at the East Bay Meditation Center, they're already blending social activism with mindfulness practices. In the UK, there's the Mindfulness and Social Change Network. I think the point is that mindfulness training is a pedagogy. We have MBSR, it's an 8-week curriculum. If you're trained as a teacher, you have these modules. So these curricula are not set in stone. I think there's a wide open opportunity to recreate mindfulness curricula, expand our horizons, seeing the structural causes of stress and many other elements that affect us. Therapeutic mindfulness, and even I would say classical Buddhism for that matter, are focused on what is called first level suffering. The first order of suffering is old age, sickness, and death. We can obviously see the sources of second order suffering. It could be like genocide, corporate practices causing chemicals that are causing cancer. We can pinpoint perpetrators of those causes of stress. They're visible in the second order, but they're larger than the personal. They're outside the person's psyche. And then we have the third order of suffering, and that's where it gets really hard to pinpoint. The neoliberal aspect of society is entangled then in first and second level suffering. It's almost like the sources of that level of suffering are almost invisible. So it becomes very hard to work with it.
Now you're talking about an analytical practice. The practitioner of mindfulness would actually be using mindfulness as it's translated properly, recollecting all of these three levels in which suffering is created for human beings and ostensibly our animal brothers and sisters, our vegetable brothers and sisters, basically the entire planet. So you would have in your awareness a greater sense of what the meaning of suffering is.
You make a really good point.
You're making a critique about mindfulness and you're saying there's another kind of mindfulness. So I'm very interested in this other kind of mindfulness. So you do the analytical practice and you understand the realms of suffering. You don't just look at you and say, I'm the source of suffering. What's the action-oriented practice that you would then do with the analysis?
It's hard for me to really articulate that because I'm still in the process of thinking through what that would look like.
Your critique also has shown up in the Buddhist world in America. Many of the sanghas that I know have embraced social action, whether it's feeding the hungry, getting involved in political action. There's much more of that going on in Buddhist sanghas because people want to have more community. They want to do more than just sit in silence.
Socially engaged Buddhism need to go way beyond what they're doing. I was speaking with David Loy a couple of months ago. It's still kind of an individual level service model, which is good. I think we're taking it to another level, really forging community and solidarity, and that becomes part of the practice.
Your critique of mindfulness as it's shown up in corporate America is extremely poignant, especially when it comes to the idea of a mindful employee.
Well, because I'm a management professor, I pretty hard on the corporate mindfulness club.
So tell us all about it.
I had a lot of fun writing those chapters. In particular, I attended the very first public workshop offered by the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute that was offered downtown San Francisco 4 or 5 years ago. When Google first began to develop its program, I was actually a hopeful optimist about it. I was actually in conversation with some of the leaders at Silly, and I actually sent them a paper of mine, and they really liked it. And I thought, wow, maybe this is going to be quite an innovative program that will take into account a different way of thinking about corporate stress and so forth. But I attended the event, and I walked away extremely disappointed. 60-70% of the program was rehashing Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence work. It was very sophomoric. I went to a few more events on corporate mindfulness. I went to a conference called the Awaken Leadership Conference. I took my name badge off so people would know who I was, and I didn't want them to suppress or hold back what they were saying if they knew I was there. These are corporate consultants, corporate trainers, and I've been there. I've done that for 10, 15, 20 years. Back in the day when I was involved in management consulting, organizational development, we came from a very idealistic point of view. Organizational development was a movement in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, where we had a systematic approach to go into organizations and try to actually transform them to be much more humane, much more humanistic, much more participative, to eradicate hierarchy and make it much more egalitarian. And some of my friends were in Scandinavia, and they were doing even more radical work. We had a few progressive managers here and there that were really gung-ho about doing it. And we had some really incredible successes at the plant level, at, let's say, a factory level of a corporation like General Foods or Procter & Gamble. We'd be consulting to one of the plants, and we had these remarkable results. But then the corporate headquarters became very fearful of these changes and pulled the plug, reverted back to traditional hierarchical organizations. And that's when I became disenchanted with these interventions.
You felt disenchanted with the whole idea of change management at all?
No, as I was saying, at the local levels, let's say a factory that was part of a large corporation, these were sort of pockets of innovation that actually were quite successful. But the corporate centers of power were threatened by that. I said, the problem is much larger. It's an institutionalized problem. It's an economic structural problem of the way our economy is. Companies have to answer to Wall Street, basically a threat to the notion of power.
Why did you think it would be helpful to have Google's mindfulness program taught to employees? the main thesis of mindfulness in corporations is if you teach it to your employees will produce better, they'll be able to handle more stress, means you can treat them worse and they will still perform. I'm not exactly sure how that's helpful to employees. I could see that it's very helpful to management.
So when I saw corporate mindfulness come on the scene and it was just individual level training, are you kidding me? Corporate mindfulness programs are going to turn them into gentler, kinder, more environmentally responsible corporations.
Is that what they said?
Well, they all say it. Almost every corporate mindfulness trainer will make these promises. It's the Trojan horse argument, right? Get a little mindfulness in there, and once the army comes out of the horse and when everyone's been trained in mindfulness, and suddenly corporation's going to flip and turn into an angelic force for society. And I knew that was really flawed.
Sounds like the same argument that's being used for mindfulness in the political arena.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter on mindful politics in the book. This is a meme that cuts through all schools, governments, corporations. It's a politically naive, wishful thinking to think that just training someone in breathing exercises is going to radically turn over the foundations of capitalist organizations.
Hearing you say the techniques that are delivered in, for instance, MBSR, the stress reduction techniques, don't have any way that a person could be able to take the well-being that they might be experiencing internally and look outside of themselves and see the causes of suffering around them and have the motivation to do something that might actually compromise their own power, to do something that might make it so that they have to possibly become less rich, less exploitative. There's no translation here. This is what I'm hearing you say.
Anything's possible. But I think what's missing is there's not that collective pulling together of people that can then have a conversation about, this particular corporate practice is really causing a lot of negativity and, we don't think it's right. Those conversations are not part of the process in corporate mindfulness training. The structural causes of stress and suffering within corporations, the toxic cultures and so forth. There's not a link to corporate social responsibility either. Would imagine it's extremely hard to sell a corporate mindfulness program if you're telling the sponsors, the senior executives, like, we're going to analyze some of the corporate policies and practices and even maybe the products that we make, like at Monsanto, poster child for mindfulness back in the late 90s. Corporate mindfulness programs are like integrity bubbles. They offer a small oasis of relief for a small number of employees. But the corporation as a whole are still producing externalities that could be detrimental or harmful to society.
It seems like a mindfulness program in a company becomes a way to license the company to behave badly because it has a mindfulness program.
It's equivalent to greenwashing that the corporations were doing with environmentalism.
People do this in their own lives. And I think that's a critique that you would have, again, of mindfulness.
Yeah, and it comes back to the neoliberal doctrine of individual responsibility again. One example I use in the book is recycling. For example, the Keep America Beautiful campaign, when we came up with the term litter bug. And then there was that public service ad with the Native American with the tears. At face value, it seems very benevolent, but it obscures the real problem, and that is corporate polluters of making plastic bottles.
The other thing that I really heard you just say that I really got, that for you, the next step looks like any practice that you might be doing would be eliciting a sense of collectivity and then would have a mechanism in which you could do some kind of collective action to make actual change happen, not just in your life, but in a larger way that might actually change the way the culture views itself, behaves, etc.
Because mindfulness started out and got locked into the biomedical world, it became recontextualized uncritically into a neoliberal ethos, transplant of Western Buddhism into, from the East to the West. And we're still in a process of cultural translation, right? I mean, it's been 50, 100 years at most. But in terms of mindfulness in particular, it's like 1979. And I mean, that's kind of when it became medicalized and seen as a therapeutic technique. we've ignored other particular hosts. I'm thinking about historically, like the beloved community of the civil rights movement is an example of how the religious impulse was a fuel for building these collective movements that were value-driven and supported by the community. We haven't done that yet, even for Western Buddhism for that matter.
My thesis around why that hasn't happened, the civil rights movement was populated by people who were so threatened and needed to make change in order to live in this country. And there were cadres of the upper middle class who invested time and energy with them to make that happen, because they just couldn't imagine America continuing to so thoroughly negate an entire race of people that lived here. I feel like both Western Buddhism as well as the mindfulness movement has always been populated by the upper middle class. And therefore, there is no incentive really to change the outside, because the outside is actually conducive to them having what they want. That's why it's always been focused on the inside, which is true of psychology as well, frankly, because in the West, it's been an individual endeavor. It just appears to me as though this thing is different than the civil rights movement and much more difficult to try to interject something that is probably going to bring external suffering to a group of people that are not interested in suffering at all.
It may be the fact that we just haven't reached a collective level of pain yet to get to the critical turning point for that to happen.
Global warming is the thing that's going
to the climate emergency is going to do it.
Yeah.
It's already happening. And I don't know why we're taking our time.
You have to have it in your face.
Yeah.
Be motivated to do something. We're doing this dialogue before the book has been released. What are you anticipating in terms of the way it's going to be received?
I wrote the book, it's out there, and I'm moving on to the next thing. It's my offering to unfreeze where we got stuck and how we can reclaim mindfulness for greater social good.
There is one more thing I wanted to talk about. You used a term called magical voluntarism in relationship to how mindfulness programs have been co-opted and adopted by psychologists, clinicians.
Well, here's what David Smale says. And when he talks about magical voluntarism, he says the central connection here is that with perhaps the expert help of your therapist or counselor, you can change the world you are in so that it no longer causes you distress.
Magical voluntarism actually means you become a volunteer for yourself, and you take all that energy and you're told you can change your life.
If the story you find yourself in causes you distress, tell yourself another one. Just tell yourself another story.
Yes, of course, that's narrative therapy. I can see how you would look at the way Western mindfulness has been presented as a form of magical voluntarism.
So psychological distress from that point of view of magical voluntarism is nothing more than unhappiness brought about by your failure to accommodate and to adapt. So material conditions really have no bearing or factor, or the situation you were born into has no bearing or factor. So that, I think, your salvation just depends on your personal act of will, basically.
The way mindfulness is taught, it's just an accommodation strategy.
And that's why it's gaining such widespread acceptance in the clinical psychological worlds. It's a therapeutic ideology based on magical voluntarism.
What I would say about that is, if you are a clinician that only talks to your patients and you don't actually have something that can help them create real change in the organismic system, then yes, mindfulness would be like CBT, where you tell people the problem is how you're thinking, you just need to change your thoughts.
The problem's all inside our heads, and if we just stop ruminating and get self-regulate, then society will be fine. That's really naive.
Well, spoken in that way, I agree. It is really naive. Hard to know what will save the world at this point.
Yeah.
So it was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you, Ron. And I am so looking forward to the reception of your book. It's timely, it's necessary.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoy your podcast as well. I really appreciate your support.
You bet. Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.